Welcome back to 2.5 Hours. I'm Brian Becker. We're here in our Washington, D.C. studio with Dr. Daoud Khairallah. He's an adjunct professor at Georgetown Law Center, and Eugene Puryear, political analyst and writer. And on the phone from Denmark, Bashy Quraishy. He is the chairman of the Advisory Council for the European Network Against Racism. We're discussing the imposition of severe economic sanctions by the EU and the United States against Iran, purportedly in response to Iran's nuclear program. We're going to talk about what the implications are for regional peace, for global peace, and for what the likely impact of these sanctions are on Iran. Dr. Daoud Khairallah, let's start with you. Is this a real crisis? Is this a manufactured crisis? It certainly has become a dominant piece of the news here in Washington, D.C.
I think it is substantially manufactured. There is no justification to create all this hullabaloo about it, the sanctions, threats of war, and mobilization of whatever efforts and troops. What Iran has done, the nuclear program of Iran, is absolutely legal. I mean, no one has questioned the legality. And it's a member of a treaty, and there is an agency that surveys what is going on, and it visits Iran and inspects. And what Iran has done in terms of compliance with a peaceful development of a nuclear program is something that we would like other countries in the Middle East, Israel, for example, to do a fraction of that. I think it is basically, I mean, there is no logical justification for this. There is no threat to international peace and security. There is no threat to interests of major countries, including these countries. If there is, it has not been revealed. A possible misuse of atomic weapons if they fall in the hands of some. This is not an argument. I mean, we know this argument has been used against other countries, and it's without basis.
Let me turn now to Eugene Puryear. He's a political analyst and a writer here in Washington, D.C. Eugene, Daoud says that it's a manufactured crisis, that Iran is complying with the IAEA, that it has other objectives, not the objectives that have been stated. What's your view, and what are the objectives?
Well, I mean, my view is that in the sense of the case being put forward by those who are beating the war drums, there is a certain amount of manufacturing that is going on. But I think the crisis in one sense is very real, especially because the United States has been waging a covert war against Iran via special forces for at least the past decade. And additionally, I think it's worth noting, too, that this beating of the war drums around the Iran nuclear program is nothing new. In 1992, Shimon Peres actually said that Iran would most definitely have a weapon by 1999. In 1984, Alan Cranston, who is a U.S. senator at the time, said that he thought Iran would have nuclear weapons in 7 years. So really, since 1979 and the Iranian Revolution, in that year, we've seen that the United States and Israel and their security and political establishments have been trying to hype up or put on a pedestal this idea that Iran is a threat. I agree that indeed that they are not a threat, but from a military perspective. But I think they are a threat from the point of view that they follow an independent foreign policy. They refuse to be dictated to by the United States and Israel and other Western allies, whether it's Europe or in the so-called Quartet countries that deal with the other Middle East issues, or anyone else. They decide that they want to trade with countries like Venezuela, like Brazil, like Turkey, to have free relations with China and other nations. And for the United States, which we've seen over the past decade, has pursued a policy of regime change towards any sort of regime that decides to go against the dictates of the Western countries. Iran does pose a threat by lacking pliability from the perspective of the Western nations.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to turn now to Europe, to Bashy Quraishy. Bashy, it's not just the United States. We have the EU has imposed very severe economic sanctions, both in terms of the trade and import of Iranian oil and also relationship with the Iranian central bank. How does it look to you from a European point of view?
Brian, let me start by saying, first of all, that sanctions never help, and they are always ineffective. Time and again, we have seen that that it doesn't help, and it actually only strengthens the resolve of that country against whom the sanctions have been put. Coming back to the European Union, the problem is that European Union wanted to wait 6 months, but the American pressure is so relentless that they had to give it up. Because there are countries like Germany, countries like France, the big and Britain, they put pressure on other smaller countries. I live in Denmark, and Denmark didn't want to have this kind of sanction. And even countries like Greece, Spain, Italy, which are in the southern hemisphere of European Union, they were against those sanctions because those sanctions will hurt their economy, which is already in bad shape. But America is so relentless because they have a political agenda behind all those sanctions. It is not the Iranian oil. It is what Daoud and Eugene said, that America has a political agenda, and they do not like countries like Iran, Pakistan, Turkey, or those Islamic countries who stand up to America and say, excuse me, enough is enough. I mean, I come from Pakistan, and I remember that even America is forcing Pakistan not to have any dealing with Iran or to have a pipeline going to Pakistan where it needs a lot of gas and oil. America also focused very much on pressuring India not to have any dealing with Iran, and India has refused. So it is not only European Union they're pressuring everybody because they have a political agenda. They just want simply to destroy the Iranian economy by sanction against the banks and other businesses. So I don't think that Iran poses any military threat. I think it is such a ridiculous argument from Iran, from USA. Let's say that Iran has plans to build an atomic bomb, which first of all it's not building. It has legitimate concerns. But let's say that why would Iran pose a threat to America, to Europe, throwing with little bomb and then get massive retaliation from America and from... Do you think that the Iranian president and Iranian leaders are so stupid? This is just America, which wants to go to war with Iran after destroying Libya and Iraq and Afghanistan and other countries, So that is what I'm very, very scared, and many Europeans are also very scared. When I speak with people, I was in France day before yesterday and met the vice prime minister of Turkey, and they're all talking about what will happen next.
Okay, Bashy, thank you for that. Daoud, we know that there's a history to this, that there's the time period between 1951, 52, 53, where the Iranian government at that time, democratically elected Prime Minister Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh, nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which we now know as BP or British Petroleum, and for that crime of trying to take control of Iran's oil, very severe economic sanctions were imposed on Iran. It destabilized the economy. And then the CIA and M16 moved in and overthrew a democratically elected government and brought the Shah to the throne. And he denationalized the oil and gave it back to Western powers. I want to ask you two questions. Is it similar to that? Is this a history repeating itself? And secondly, can it have that kind of effectiveness that it had between 51 and 53?
I think the U.S. Doesn't miss an opportunity to fail, to prove its commitment to democracy. And it started with Mossadegh and the CIA bringing down a popular guy, and that its policy is purely self-serving and doesn't have to do anything with the values that the U.S. Claims and preach in the world. I think what they want is Iran under our thumb. Iran, there are other countries that have nuclear programs that are not bound by any international treaties, are not subject to any kind of inspection or verification. They can do whatever they want with their nuclear weapons. They have weapons also. In the Iran case, Iran says, we do not intend to develop weapons. We want to use our nuclear power for generating power and for peaceful purposes. And nevertheless, the U.S. has focused on Iran as basically it is Israel, in my judgment, that is the main concern. Iran, even if we assume that it would have nuclear powers, it does not create a threat to the U.S. The U.S. could pulverize a number of countries, Iran and others. It does not create a security threat to the U.S. But there is an agenda, and we know the Israeli influence on the policymakers in this country.
So, Eugene, I want to go back to where I started, but then ask you partly the same question that I asked Daoud. In some ways, the crisis seems to be, according to the three of you, a manufactured crisis because Iran doesn't really pose a nuclear threat to its neighbors or to anyone. But it's a real crisis because there's real tension and there's economic sanctions, military threats, assassinations of Iranian scientists. But I want to go back to this question of, will the sanctions really do what the imperial powers intend for them to do, or will it have a negative impact on West European and American economy based on the way the sanctions will play out? This isn't 1953. Iran has evolved, it's developed. What do you think?
Well, I think on multiple levels, the chances of the sanctions working are probably not that high. I mean, I do think that obviously the American economy, well, not the American economy, more the Western European economy could suffer from lack of being able to trade with Iran, which is something they've been doing over the next few years, and also from the point of view of the people of Iran. I think we've seen in many different countries over history that oftentimes sanctions, they arouse the feelings in people, the nationalistic feelings who don't want to be dominated, particularly a country like Iran, which has in its very recent memory an overthrow by the CIA and by the British forces, which you had mentioned previously in the 1950s. And so I think that the sanctions will have the at least possibility of really arousing the feeling of the people against these sort of impositions that are trying to be imposed, whether it's from London or Washington or Paris or anywhere else. Although I think obviously what the Western powers are hoping is that if they can increase the privations on people, because they know that sanctions mainly hurt the regular everyday people, not the higher-ups who are the so-called targets, I think they're hoping that by increasing the privations that the people of Iran have to go to, they can re-energize movements that are aimed at the overthrow of the Islamic Republic.
Bashy, I want to come back to you with the same question that I asked Daoud and Eugene about the economic sanctions and their impact, not simply on Iran. Clearly, they're designed to have a destabilizing impact on Iran's economy. But what will be its impact on Europe and on the European Union, which is dependent in many ways on the import of Middle Eastern oil? You had mentioned that if it was up to the EU countries, they would have pushed this deadline for the imposition of sanctions or this new level of sanctions off for 6 months, but the United States said no.
Well, that is the problem that, unfortunately, still today, America has that power as a big brother that they can push the Council of the Council of Ministers in European Union to do what they want. And if there are big countries like France, Britain, and Germany, if they agree, then the smaller countries like Denmark and Balkan countries, other small countries, they don't have that power. So they can get through with this thing. And it is going to hurt, which I have been noticing now, statements coming from Greece and Italy and Spain, that they are very much dependent on Iranian oil because it's closer and somehow it's also cheaper. They have special agreements with Greece, for example, and the economy in those countries is very bad. And if they have to get oil, expensive oil from some other places, then it will hurt their economy. And when you read European newspaper, you do not see any public backing to this sanction. It is only on the elite level, on the government level, on the EU Commission level. Not even the Parliament is agreeing with that. But again, USA gets away with all what they want. But I would also like to add, and I'm sure that Iranian authorities, they know that it will come, so they have made some alternative arrangement. Like China have actually doubled the import of Iranian oil from now on. India wants to pay Iranian oil in gold instead of dollar. So, and Pakistan and many other countries which get oil, there is a lot of development, and I am definitely that it will not have any effect on Iranian economy as America is. And America knows that sanction never works. I think it is a pretext somehow to go and attack Iran. This is what I am very, very afraid. This kind of a preparation, like what happened in Libya, for example, And all this talk of America's democratic push in those countries to have a democracy, to have freedom of speech, this is totally not genuine, because look what happened in Libya when Gaddafi said, open everything, become friends. In 2009, he was meeting Obama and then they went in and killed him,
Well, let me ask you, and I want to come back to you since you're on the phone and only here for our first segment. And I want to ask the two gentlemen in the studio the same question. It seems to be a highly irrational, illogical set of circumstances whereby Europe is facing its biggest economic crisis since the 1930s. The future of the economy of the EU hangs by the thread. The last thing that European Union economies, especially the more fragile economies, would want is higher oil prices. And yet the United States is demanding that the EU authorities take a policy regarding Iran that can only be harmful to the European economy.
Totally, I agree with you, and that is why there is no public backing. But the problem is our democratic system is such, once you elect people for 4 years, then you just have to obey the orders. And our top countries, France, Germany, and UK, they are very much aligned with America, so they do whatever America tells them. That is a big problem for us, and this undermines European democratic institution, but also our economy, because as I keep on mentioning, the biggest problem is in Greece, Italy, Spain, where unemployment is very, very heavy. There is no construction, there is no industry development. So we will have a problem if this kind of sanction come into function, and those people have to suffer. So I'm sure that there will be some kind of arrangement, they will do under the table, and they say, okay, we will maybe continue making, countries can make their own arrangement with Iran instead of that they go according to the European Commission's demands. Greece have said to the European Commission that please give us some grace period because we are dependent, and they know that very well.
Bashy, let me go to Daoud here in our studio. Bashy mentioned the issue of Libya. Now, yes, the U.S. went in; they were able, with the NATO allies, to bomb the Libyan government out of existence. But that was a country of 6 million people, of course, very oil resource rich. But Iran is a big country. It's 80 million people. It's self-sufficient largely in food. It's developed a lot of independent economic structures. If this is undermining Europe, undermining the European Union's economic prognosis at a critical moment, and the sanctions can't really work, then what's the bottom line? Or what's the game plan? And finally, is there a game plan, or is this kind of just politics in Washington?
I think if it is a game plan, I think it's a dumb one. First, there are two objectives that the U.S. would like to achieve, and it is missing on both of them. One, this siege that it has imposed on Iran has had a different impact, has made of Iran a more self-confident, more autonomous, has enabled Iran to build a military might that is to be taken into consideration in the Gulf area.
You mean the sanctions over the past 30 years?
Absolutely, yeah. The whole policy is a dumb policy. With respect to the sanctions, take the oil, which is first of all, the fungibility of oil makes this is a futile exercise. Even if Iran would be forced to lower the price, give a discount a little bit, wouldn't this create a huge temptation for China to build a reserve and take that oil? China is a competitor of the U.S. It is helping all the competing interests to put the U.S. at a disadvantage. That's why I think there is no prudence in this policy. It just satisfies some curiosity here in the U.S. and in Washington in particular, Israeli lobbies and things like this. But I don't think that this is in the best interest of the U.S. on the long run.
Eugene Puryear, the Israeli establishment, which we've alluded to, has both. It's both an ally of the United States, the largest recipient of U.S. foreign aid from any country, gets $3 billion a year, so in some ways dependent on U.S. aid, but it has its own regional and national interests or perceived interests. And there's a lot of talk by Ehud Barak and others, he's the defense minister of Israel, that time is running out, that there's this kind of existential threat of Iran's nuclear program, and that Israel, the implication, should strike. Is it likely, and will it have any effect?
Well, I think what we've seen, and we've seen it play out very interestingly in the Israeli media, is that there's a significant number of individuals who are former retired members of the security establishment in Israel who have made a point over the past several months to continue to come out and say that an attack on Iran is something that they should not do. I think what we also are seeing, though, and especially, and I think this is interesting, is we've seen in the Israeli establishment so much anger. The main place we've been seeing this riling up for Israel to attack is the Republican Party in the United States, and clearly the Prime Minister Netanyahu is trying to create sort of a separate power center from the president in Congress and use the sort of the whip, if you will, of Congress on the president to try to gain support for his desire. I think it is his desire by Prime Minister Netanyahu's to attack Iran, which I think he feels he doesn't have support for inside of a significant part of his own establishment. So I'm not sure if that makes it more or less likely. I think it makes it less likely in some senses if they can't get a consensus inside of Israel itself, particularly amongst the security cabinet, which is, in my view, probably what is playing out. But nevertheless, with the powerful backing of the United States, particularly powerful figures in the United States, it certainly is possible that Israel could attack. But I wanted to follow up a little bit on a previous point, because I do think there is a game plan in some senses. I think it's a long-term game plan. Thomas Friedman, many people know him, the writer for the New York Times, once said that McDonald's doesn't work without McDonnell Douglas. And the general point he was making is that the free trade regime that the Western countries really rely on for their prosperity. I mean, we talk about big countries in Europe, Germany, the German export machine. You see in the United States, not only President Obama, but important figures like the head, Seafred Bergson of the Peterson Institute, saying the United States needs to trade more. So thereby, the inability of them to dictate the terms of trade, which is essentially what the preponderance of force allows the United States to do, is a serious problem. And so if countries like China, which are definitely competitors of the United States, Iran, other countries feel that they can make deals not just without the United States, but even the deals they make with the United States have to be made on a level of parity, that could be a significant problem to both Europe and the United States, who are looking to come out of this crisis by increasing their exports at the expense of other nations.
Bashy, I want to pick up on Eugene's point. It's a very interesting point. He's sort of painting a picture that these sanctions are part of an effort to hold back the tide of history in a way. In other words, that China becomes independent, Iran is independent, Turkey, Brazil, that the United States that had a sort of a unipolar authority globally, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union, can see that the world economic situation is changing, and it's kind of a desperate act on the part of the United States to stop independent governments with substantial economies from being able to grow. Do you see it that way?
Absolutely. I agree both with Dr. Daoud and Eugene. Eugene mentioned Thomas Friedman. Let me mention you Dr. Henry Kissinger, who in 1973 actually threatened the Arabs, and he said, I'm going to quote him, if there is another oil embargo, we would just come and take over your oil field. And that is what is happening. Look, American economy is totally going to the dogs. You know, they are living on the borrowing money from the Arabs, from the Chinese, and they are just printing dollars all over. They have nothing to back it up. Now, how do you create jobs again? To go and bomb other people, weapon industry, oil industry, all those industries, they can only produce if it has people to buy things. And America at the moment does not have that kind of economy. So I think America does have a very long-term plan to keep on creating conflicts, fictional conflict, fighting, war, so that somehow their economy can function. Problem is that time is gone now. China, Brazil, BRIC countries, even smaller countries like Turkey, Indonesia, they are challenging America, and this is unfortunate that America and other Anglo-Saxon countries like Germany, UK, and France, they do not like this competition, this concurrence. So that is what I think is the problem, that they do not want anybody challenging them, whether politically, economically, or even historically or culturally. As long as they have this mindset, then they will keep on creating problems, Look, I come from Pakistan. Every day they kill lots of people with these drone attacks. Pakistan government have said, don't do that. They continue doing that. And they don't even listen, and they call Pakistan an ally. I mean, Iran, let's say Iran is not an ally, but Pakistan is an ally, and they're killing people there too. So this agenda, I think, will continue. It's not going to stop until and unless somebody put a stop to that. And you can only put a stop that you challenge them economically, not militarily. That you can't do that. Challenge them economically, and that is what is happening now, and that makes Americans scared.
Bashy, thank you very much. We're going to have time for just one last question in this segment. Dr. Daoud, the idea that endless war is being created or conflicts in order to sort of stem this prospect of independent economic powers, just in the next 10, 15 seconds, do you think that's the operative strategy here?
I don't think so. It's such a short-sighted thing. You cannot reverse the tide of history and the natural development in the world in terms of I mean, the economies of most of the countries in the world have changed substantially, and it's a reality that the U.S. and other countries would have to take into consideration. I doubt very much that this is a policy that would lead somewhere, at least would lead somewhere that will be in the interest of the U.S. or would meet the expectation at the U.S. behind such policy.
Okay, we're gonna take a short break. Bashy, Quraishi, I want to thank you for joining us from Denmark. We'll see you next time. We're going to take a short break where we're discussing the impact of sanctions from the United States and the EU on Iran and its likely impact on the regional and global politics. We'll be right back.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Welcome back to 2.5 Hours. I'm Brian Becker. We're in our Washington, D.C. studio with Dr. Daoud Khairallah. He's a professor at Georgetown Law Center, and Eugene Puryear, a political analyst and activist and writer. And on the phone in this segment by Phil Wilayto. He is a longtime commentator on politics in the Middle East, particularly on Iran. He's been to Iran and has written a book about Iran. Welcome, Phil.
Hi, how are you doing?
Good, very good. Phil, I'm going to start with you since you're just joining us. In the first segment of the show, we talked about whether or not the crisis in Iran is a manufactured crisis, an artificial crisis, meaning, of course, that the United States and its EU or NATO partners are overstating the so-called threat from Iran's nuclear program and creating a crisis. But then it's a real crisis in the sense that there really is sanctions, there's intensifying sanctions, there's the threats of military action, both sides climbing the escalation ladder in response. How do you make it out? What do you think is happening right now? What's the cause of this, and what's its likely outcome in the coming period?
I was just reading a story in the New York Times yesterday speculating about whether what the effect would be of European sanctions and what the effect would be if Iran carries through on its current threat to cut off oil exports to Europe if they just decide to go ahead with the plans to embargo Iranian oil even before they implement that. And the commentary was that the loss of Iran oil could be made up by Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Libya. And, I just reacted to the inclusion of Iraq and Libya, realizing that a few years ago, these would have been two countries that were allied. That Syria, that Libya was considered an ally of Iran, and Iraq, although it was adversary, was also standing up to the United States, and so might not want to play that role of making up oil from Iran. So Iran's isolated now in a way that it hasn't been in a long time. During the Vietnam War, we were always told there was a domino theory. If one country fell to socialism, other countries would follow. Well, we've had a domino series of events in the Middle East, and Iran is the grand prize for the West. So even though the charges against Iran are manufactured, it doesn't mean that they don't intend to go ahead with everything up to and possibly including war. And the proof of that, if anyone needs it, is just that they went to war in Iraq based on a lie, and after the lie was exposed and they had to admit it, they just kept going with more excuses. So it's a very, very serious situation. And at this point, I think it has a certain momentum on its own that makes it even more dangerous.
Okay, thank you. Daoud, you ended the last segment, so I'm going to start with Eugene on this one. Phil Wilayto is making the comparison with the invasion of Iraq, and clearly there are some. There was before the run-up of the March 2003 invasion, a presentation by the Bush administration that Iraq presented a threat, a nuclear threat perhaps, or certainly had weapons of mass destruction. That all turned out to be untrue, but the U.S. was able to go in, invade Iraq, knock out the Iraqi government in about 3 weeks, even though later it encountered great resistance. What are the similarities and what are the differences with Iran?
Well, I'll tell you one place where you see the similarities quite clearly is in the Republican Party debates where, they consistently talk about the threat of Iran having a nuclear weapon. And it's very reminiscent to what I'm sure we all remember when Condoleezza Rice went on television and said, we don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud. So certainly in terms of the ramp up, there's certainly a lot of this same hysteria. The front page of the 90th anniversary edition of Foreign Affairs magazine was an article by Stephen Krasner, who formerly worked in the Department of Defense, saying, time to attack Iran, ? And of course his conclusion was that yes, it is time to attack Iran. So I think that right there is perhaps the media campaign, or the campaign by various experts in the media and who were for the war in Iran to sort of pump this up, I think is very similar to the war in Iraq. I think one thing that we see that is quite different is that the American people have the experience of the war in Iraq. And I think that the experience of the American people and the clearly manufactured weapons of mass destruction evidence inside of Iraq has soured people on the idea of these sort of preemptive wars, at least from the point of view of their sort of initial reaction to it. And so I think different from the war in Iraq is I don't think it will be as easy for the forces who are pro-war, which is why I think they have to be extremely hysterical, as the Republican Party candidates are, in order to at least attempt to convince the American people, who I think just sort of implicitly, because of the experience in Iraq, have a high degree of experience with these kind of the legitimation or the lack of legitimation of these claims.
Daoud, Khairallah, the American people have certainly had a bitter sort of understanding of the Iraq war. They were lied to. Thousands died. Tens of thousands were wounded, not to mention the maybe 1 million Iraqis who perished. But there's another difference, too, which is that Iran is not Iraq. I mean, Iran is a big country. It's 80 million people. It's a substantial military apparatus. There's no possible way that the United States could think that they could invade Iran and somehow do to the Iranian government what they did to the Iraqi government. Do you see it that way?
I see several points of difference and some manifestations of what we see, especially in the Republican debate and in the going discourse in this country and this city in particular. It is frightening that mistakes, deliberate distortion of facts, manufacturing of reasons to take this country to wars, with all the losses in human, material, moral image, and there are no consequences. And we still hear the same decision makers playing a game that is so detached from reality. And when they talk about Iran and what they will do with Iran and things like this, you wouldn't think that Iran is a completely different game. And the U.S. is a different U.S. now, internationally, internally, and military, and every way, in every other way. They talk about it in such a reckless way. And for what reason? For what purpose? We don't know. This is what is so astonishing, that there is no accountability in a country like this country, in a society that is as developed as this society, with watchdogs in the media that are supposed to be active and really calling all these games that are being played by politicians. Unfortunately, there is room to be worried. Now, I hope we will not make the same mistakes that were made in Iraq, because the consequences to this country, reputational risk, and in every other way, would be disastrous.
Phil Wilayto, back to you. The Bush administration in 2002, in its State of the Union address, said that there's an axis of evil, and it said Iraq, Iran, North Korea. North Korea immediately announced that it did have nuclear weapons, and the U.S. started negotiating with them. Iraq was invaded. In the case of Iran, it became sort of a priority that got delayed because the U.S. got bogged down in Iraq. I mean, the resistance to the U.S. invasion in Iraq was so great that the idea that the U.S. could actually invade Iran seems remote at this point, given the military situation. And I want to ask you to comment on that, but also to comment on something else. When Bush went to war in Iraq, he said he had the coalition of the willing, which looked more like a coalition of the bribed and coerced. Very few countries outside of the UK. Who would be the partners really with the United States as they go down this road?
Well, on the first question, I think a ground invasion of Iran is out of the question. This country of 75 million people, and their history is, regardless of internal differences, they unite against an outside foe. And there's no reason to believe that Iranians would be ambivalent about an attack on their country. I see President Netanyahu of Israel stated in the last couple of days that Iranians would welcome an attack on their country. That's just insane. Anybody who knows anything about the reality, there isn't even a member of the Green dissident movement that comes out in support of sanctions, let alone any kind of military attack. And in addition to getting bogged down in Iraq, I think another factor in holding the U.S. and Israel back from attacking Iran in any way is the Israeli Defense Forces defeat in Lebanon by the non-state resistance movement Hezbollah. Some people believe that if that invasion of Lebanon had been successful, then they would have been emboldened, but they got bogged down there. So the three things that I think are holding off an attack at this point is, one, the strength of the Iranian state, the military and the relative unity of its people in terms of outside attack or aggression. Secondly, the reluctance of the U.S. military to commit its forces into another war where those forces are already showing great signs of stress from repeated deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. And one indication of that, of course, they wouldn't want to talk about is with all the problems there are in the program being presented by Ron Paul, pretty much a thoroughly reactionary program in terms of domestic issues and race. He is for withdrawing U.S. forces from overseas and not going to war not supporting these imperialist wars, and he has received more financial donations from U.S. military personnel than all other Republican candidates combined, which is quite a thing, and it's really something to take note of. So I think there's some fear on the part of the military establishment in the U.S. And the third thing would be, the reaction of the U.S. people, which is not definitive, as we saw that in Iraq. It's a factor, and an important factor as it spreads throughout the population, particularly into more conscious layers of the union movement and working people who could take on a political role, as, say, the West Coast longshoremen have when they shut down all the West Coast ports in protest of the war in Iraq. But primary among all of these is the issue of the strength of Iran that makes the U.S. pause.
Thanks, Phil. I'm going to turn back to Dr. Daoud, Khairallah, and to Eugene. Either one of you can start off with this. The other question that I wanted to throw back in is the U.S. says that if Iranian oil is prevented from being sold to European countries or to others, that other oil producers can make up the difference, that somehow there can be enough oil on the market that it won't have an impact on price, meaning that there would be a cushion so that the European Union, which is going into recession, won't go deeper into recession, or that the United States, which is just barely emerging from recession, won't return to a recession. I want to ask either of you, is there a substitute for Iranian oil? Iranian oil is a greater oil production certainly than Iraq's.
Yes, well, Iran is number 4 in the world, I believe, in oil production. I think that, obviously, traditionally, the Western powers have relied on Saudi Arabia to up their quota in these sorts of situations, and Saudi Arabia has historically shown they're willing to do so. But the real question outside of Saudi Arabia, which obviously alone cannot make up it, is what is the current state of the oil production inside of Iraq and inside of Libya? I mean, we know inside of Iraq, that was what Donald Rumsfeld said, well, we don't need to spend a lot of money on the war because we'll just start pumping oil and it'll pay for the whole thing. And what we've seen is that because of the great destruction that has happened in that country, it's been very hard for the oil production to meet the rise to the levels of which we know that it's capable because of what they have in terms of proven oil reserves. I think the same thing is there with Libya. So, obviously they've been working on this for some time, trying to put together some sort of plan. So perhaps it is possible a shortfall could be ameliorated, but I don't think that they could possibly make up completely for a complete embargo of Iranian oil at least in the Western European oil market. And I think what we're seeing from countries like India and like China show how essential Iranian oil production is to the overall world market for oil.
And again, what about the allies? Who that was the second question I asked Phil Wilayto. I want to come back to that too. The U.S. had almost no allies when it came to the invasion of Iraq. I call it the coalition of bribed and coerced, not the coalition of the willing. Who are their allies in this instance, and are they really allies?
Other than Israel, I doubt there are allies who would go with the U.S. on this adventure militarily. And some European countries might show solidarity of sort, but putting soldiers on the ground and things like this, I doubt very much that there will be allies the way it happened in Iraq. At least they have learned from Iraq, and they have seen the limitations and what they know about the situation in Iran is intimidating by itself. So one would hope that they would have a say in reasoning U.S. decision maker, depending on who will be those decision makers, about taking such an adventurous step. I don't see natural allies or countries that could be of help to the U.S. going into this adventure. I think so many things are different here, and this is not an easy decision. By the way, what we know, what we hear, what we read, is that the military is not very enthusiastic about such a step, the U.S. military. So, and they are the voice of reason, and they are the guys who are on the ground and who know. it is mostly the politicians, like we hear in the Republican parties, who sing this tune and who keep agitating the international and the local environment about this issue.
Phil Wilayto, you have studied Iran, you have written about Iran, you have taken Americans to Iran to have people-to-people delegations. I want to ask you two things and ask your overview on it. When President Bush left office in January 2009, there was a great optimism, a euphoria that not only was Bush leaving, but perhaps the Bush era was ending. That there would be peace in different parts of the world, a relaxation of tensions that were the sort of the signal part of the Bush foreign policy. When President Obama went to Cairo on June 4th, 2009, speaking to the Muslim world, so-called, he for the first time acknowledged that the U.S. had, quote, some role in the overthrow of the democratically elected government of Iran in 1953. I didn't say much more than that. But since then, U.S. policy seems to have reverted and be almost identical to or even more hostile than towards Iran than it was during the second Bush administration. Clearly, Obama's not Bush. He's a Democrat, not a Republican, the first black president. What accounts for this continuity or even escalation of tensions with Iran from your point of view?
Oh, you've thrown me a softball here, Brian. There's a consistency in U.S. policy towards the Middle East that goes back through virtually every American administration since the discovery of oil and there. As a matter of fact, a guy like Dennis Ross, who's a practically fanatical supporter of Israel, was the key person advising U.S. presidents, every U.S. president, going back to Jimmy Carter. He just recently left the Obama White House. And the reason, of course, is because the world depends on oil to function, the modern industrial world. It's the blood of the body of world commerce. And the Middle East contains 2/3 of the world's known oil reserves. Whoever can control that flow of oil, even if they don't own it outright, can control the economy of the world. The United States imports 10% of its oil from the Persian Gulf, but Europe imports 40%, and Japan, I think, an even higher amount. It's the gold mine. It's the Holy Grail, and Iran is the last standing obstacle to U.S. hegemony over that oil field. No U.S. president is going to jeopardize the chance to advance U.S. corporate interests in that area. And I think there's been a great disappointment in Iran, as well as throughout the Middle East, both among government figures and among the people as a whole. In terms of Obama, there actually was some modest optimism that there could be some modest change in policy of the U.S. towards Iran, and that's been proven not to be true. And I think the people are just going back to a hard realism, understanding that this is going to be continued aggression until one side or the other gives in or gives up or is defeated.
Eugene, let me go back to you. The run-up to the Iraq War was also evidenced by the creation of a very large anti-war movement, mm-hmm. Big, huge demonstrations, hundreds of thousands of people, month after month. It didn't stop the war, but it certainly was evidence that the American people, in great numbers, perhaps the majority, were in fact opposed to the invasion. Mm-hmm. There was the drama of U.S. soldiers going to Iraq, so of course it appeared like the Vietnam War mm-hmm. in some ways. There are now protests being scheduled about the possibility of war and the intensification of sanctions here. Can you just tell us what's going on in the United States?
Certainly. Well, February 4th, which is a week from this Saturday, there's going to be a nationally coordinated day of local actions, which means just around the country, people will be coming out in their different cities, including here in Washington, D.C., to protest not only the impending potential attack on Iran, but also any sort of covert war, assassinations, and the things that we know the United States has been doing against Iran. The Answer Coalition at answercoalition.org is one of the groups that has endorsed this call. There's many groups who have endorsed this call who are going forward, and I think it's just another sign that the American people have learned from the Iraq situation and are trying to mobilize in the earliest stages of this potential run-up to a war to try to at least raise the consciousness in America about what is really going on in Iran. What are the real facts? Because I think that what we saw in Iraq were that, sort of the old adage that if you repeat a lie enough times it becomes the truth, that, you just say enough times Iraq has WMDs and, people just generally start to think that, well, it could be true. I mean, look at who this is. And so I think that February 4th will be a very important day from the point of view of the movement, not just against the war in Iran or potential war in Iran, but also just trying to raise the consciousness level of people around the country about what's actually going on there.
Daoud, when President Obama recently made his State of the Union address, he sort of hyped the idea that there's no option off the table, meaning the military option against Iran, and the Congress erupted in applause, sort of showing its jingoistic, bellicose character. And then the next line he said, of course, we're open to negotiations with Iran. And there was very kind of muted applause in Congress. That wasn't as exciting to the Congress people of a negotiated settlement. But do you see this partly as the precursor to negotiations? And what do you think Iran's position is on that?
I think the State of the Union address was described as an election address. He was at the same time talking to public at large, appeasing some elements who would be moving in the direction that would please Israel and the Israeli lobby and pressure groups here. I think this was, to a certain extent, a lip service to those. From another standpoint, what he immediately later said, we are open to talk, is, as we said, there is no option off the table. We say at the same time, we're still ready to talk, but we know the limits of both options. At the same time, when we increase the pressure, the sanctions and things like this, it's an exercise in futility that the U.S. continues, unfortunately, to play for reasons that are not that clear when you think of the U.S. interest, every aspect of the U.S. interest in the world and internally.
Okay, Phil Wilayto, I want to come back and ask you some of the same questions. And there's been a caricaturing of Iran, as there had been for the Iraqi government prior to the invasion. That's sort of a standard fare now, the demonization of targeted countries. In terms of sort of reaching the American public, which I know you are trying to do as well, there is the February 4th Day of Actions, but what else are you doing in terms of sort of being part of that grassroots sort of truth-telling operation?
Well, I'm happy to be able to say that there's going to be a protest in my hometown, Richmond, Virginia, and it wasn't hard to convince people to come out on that. I think the latest count is 30 cities where there'll be protests. It's what is the best way to reach out? I think one thing would be to have some protests at some gas stations over the next coming months. The price of gasoline at the pump is going to go up, and that's a good deal in part because of the uncertainty over the availability of oil from the Persian Gulf region, and to pass out leaflets to people, talk to people. But we're looking into trying to set up some meetings with some more open-minded members of Congress. There's several national anti-war conferences coming up this year. We'll be reaching out more to activists. What the guest mentioned earlier about telling the big lie, that is really what we're up against. It's the phrase, Iran's nuclear ambitions has been repeated so many times that I think people believe that where there's smoke, there's fire, and the demonization of Iran's leadership as irrational, fanatically religious, don't care if they die or not. This has been ingrained in people's minds, even though there's just no basis in fact, and they don't believe it themselves. When the government talks to itself, it goes out of its way to try to bring people back to reality. I think that this has to be linked up with the economic issues. You can't just have an anti-war movement off on one side of the political scene and the economic struggle on the other. It has to be brought into the Occupy movement in a more forceful way. I hope people are reaching out to those movements to promote involvement in February 4th. Need to get into the unions, the churches, the community groups. Our big problem is that there is not the Iran solidarity movement in this country that there was, say, during the U.S. aggression against Central America or against Cuba. The demonization has been very deep, and there's great confusion within the anti-war movement. And so part of that struggle has to take place within the anti-war movement to convince people.
Okay,
that,
Phil, thank you. We're winding down here. We have 2 minutes left. Eugene, I know that your group and others who are part of this big February 4th Day of Actions are also reaching out to the people in different cities. The oddity that I think people may not know or think about because of the way the regime in Iran has been caricatured is that while Iran has no nuclear weapon, nobody asserts that they do, and that while they're going along with the IAEA monitoring, the United States and Israel do have a huge nuclear arsenal and have used it. So tell us what you're saying to people out on the street.
Well, what we're saying to people right now, I mean, one way to look
at
this, one way to look at it is, I have to say this, is when the research reactor in Tehran was set up, it was got its uranium through the U.S. Atoms for Peace program. That program gave people highly enriched uranium. That means that for a significant number of years, Iran had highly enriched uranium and chose not to weaponize it. So the very fact that now that it's asserted that they have 20% enriched uranium, which is sort of the lowest level quote unquote for weaponization, that now all of a sudden there's this new great danger that they're going to develop nuclear weapons, goes against the entire practice of the Iranian nuclear program over the entire existence of the Islamic Republic, which was not to enrich uranium to a weapons grade capacity. And so I think we're trying to just explore these sorts of things with people, to let them know sort of the truth about what's going on with Iran's nuclear program, what's its history, what are other comparable countries, what kind of nuclear setup do they have that, is Iran an outlier, or is it like many other countries? And I think it's like many other countries, Argentina, Brazil, who also have similar type of programs and have collaborated with Iran in the past. And so pointing out that this is strictly political and that there is no rational basis or historical basis to say that Iran all of a sudden is a fanatical country that has 20% enriched uranium and will be able to have a nuclear bomb tomorrow.
Daoud, we have 10 seconds left. What do you think is going to happen in the short term? Is the United States going to escalate this, and will there be a reaction both from the American people and from Europe against it?
I'm hoping that it will not. I'm hoping that they might continue to play this game, but definitely there will be enough brain in this country among decision makers to avoid such a very, very dangerous step. And my hope is, wishful thinking probably, but this is the alternative is almost the unthinkable, because it will be disastrous for everyone. And for what reason? There is no equivalent reason for that.
Okay, Daoud, Khairallah, I want to thank you very much for joining us. Eugene Puryear here in the Washington, D.C. studio. Phil Wilayto on the phone from Richmond. We'll see you next time.